My name is Lila Carter, and if you had told me 5 years ago that I'd be sitting in a boardroom with some of the most powerful people in corporate America, I would have laughed in your face. Back then, I was just another overworked analyst at Hawthorne and Company, buried under spreadsheets and PowerPoint presentations, trying to prove myself in an industry where being underestimated wasn't just common, it was expected. Hawthorne and Company isn't one of those flashy tech startups or trendy fashion brands. It's a legacy firm built on decades of mergers, acquisitions, and old-school business acumen. It's also a place where ambition often gets crushed under layers of bureaucracy and egos so big they could fill this entire building. When I first joined the company straight out of college, I thought I knew what hard work looked like. But nothing prepared me for the cutthroat world of high-stakes deals and power plays behind closed doors. I guess you could say my story starts about 3 years into my tenure here. At least, that's when things started getting interesting. By then, I'd clawed my way up from junior analyst to associate director, earning every ounce of respect through sheer determination and late nights spent perfecting pitch decks no one else wanted to touch. Still, despite all my effort, there were moments when I felt invisible, like when Michael Langley, our larger-than-life CO, breezed past me in the hallway without even acknowledging my existence. Michael wasn't exactly warm and fuzzy. He was sharp-tongued, demanding, and had a reputation for crushing anyone who dared stand in his way. To him, employees were chess pieces meant to serve his grand vision, not actual human beings with dreams and aspirations of their own. And let's just say, he didn't have much patience for anyone questioning his decisions, especially someone like me. That brings us to the day everything changed. Well, almost everything. It began innocently enough, a routine meeting called by Michael to discuss potential strategic moves for the company. At the time, Hawthorne and Company was riding high on its recent successes, but Michael always had his sights set on bigger targets. This particular morning, he walked into the conference room with the swagger of a man who already knew he'd won before the game even started. "Good morning," he said, flashing that trademark grin that somehow managed to look both charming and predatory at the same time. His eyes scanned the table, landing briefly on each executive before finally settling on me. Not because he valued my input, mind you, but because I happened to be seated closest to him. "We're looking at something truly transformative today. A merger that'll put us leagues ahead of the competition." He gestured toward the screen at the front of the room, where a sleek presentation appeared. The target? A mid-sized tech company called Nexera Technologies. According to Michael, acquiring Nexera would give us access to cutting-edge AI software that could revolutionize how we approach data analytics. On paper, it sounded impressive. In practice, not so much. As the slides flipped by, detailing financial projections and market analyses, something gnawed at the back of my mind. Something wasn't adding up. Sure, Nexera had developed some innovative tools, but their revenue streams were shaky at best, and their leadership teams seemed more focused on hype than substance. Worst of all, the price tag attached to this deal, a staggering $150 million, felt wildly inflated compared to what we'd gain in return. When Michael opened the floor for questions, I hesitated. Normally, I kept my thoughts to myself during these meetings, content to observe and absorb rather than rock the boat. But this time, something inside me snapped. Maybe it was the exhaustion from pulling yet another all-nighter prepping for this very meeting. Or maybe it was the memory of countless hours spent analyzing similar deals, only to see them fall apart later. Whatever it was, I raised my hand. "Yes." Michael asked, arching an eyebrow as though surprised anyone would dare interrupt his carefully choreographed performance. "I'm just wondering," I began cautiously, aware of the weight of everyone's stares. "Have we considered the long-term risks associated with Nexera's current cash flow issues? Their burn rate is concerning, and while their technology is promising, the valuation seems optimistic." The room fell silent. You could hear a pin drop, or maybe it was just the sound of my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, Michael simply stared at me, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, a smirk spread across his face. Well, he drawled, leaning back in his chair. "Looks like Miss Carter has decided to join the conversation. Tell me, Lila, do you think you know better than our top-tier advisors and analysts?" His tone dripped with condescension, and I felt heat rise to my cheeks. Around the table, a few colleagues exchanged uneasy glances, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. No one dared challenge Michael, especially not someone like me. "I'm just pointing out," I started, but he cut me off with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Point taken," he said dryly. "But let's not forget who holds the majority stake in this company, shall we? My shares alone account for nearly 40% of the voting power. So unless you own a significant chunk of stock yourself, I suggest you leave the decision-making to those of us who actually matter." The jab hit harder than I expected. I didn't respond, not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I knew arguing further would only make things worse. Instead, I forced a tight smile and nodded politely, retreating into silence as the meeting continued. What Michael didn't realize, and what no one else in that room knew, was that I did own stock in Hawthorne and Company. Granted, it wasn't much. Just a modest number of shares I'd purchased years ago when I first started working here, using bonuses and savings scraped together from living paycheck to paycheck. At the time, buying stock had been more symbolic than strategic, a way of proving to myself that I believed in this company, even if no one else did. But now, as Michael gloated about his dominance, a seed of an idea began to take root in my mind. Those worthless shares he'd mocked might hold more value than either of us realized. After all, every share carried voting rights, and while mine were minuscule compared to his, they weren't entirely insignificant. If played right, they could become a tool, not just for influence, but for leverage. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into researching every aspect of the proposed merger. I pored over Nexra's financial statements, interviewed industry experts, and even reached out to former employees willing to share candid insights about the company's inner workings. What I uncovered confirmed my suspicions. Nexra was essentially running on fumes, propped up by venture capital and empty promises. Their flagship product, hailed as revolutionary, was riddled with technical flaws that would require millions more in R&D to fix. And their customer retention rates? Abysmal. Armed with this information, I drafted a detailed report outlining why the merger was a bad idea. I included charts, graphs, and quotes from credible sources, making sure my argument was airtight. Then, I scheduled a private meeting with Michael. Walking into his office felt surreal. The space was everything you'd expect from a CEO. Sleek furniture, panoramic views of the city skyline, and shelves lined with awards and accolades. Michael sat behind his desk, scrolling through emails on his phone, barely sparing me a glance as I entered. "What is it, Lila?" he asked, sounding mildly irritated. "Make it quick. I've got a call in 10 minutes. I took a deep breath, clutching the folder containing my findings. "I wanted to share my analysis of the Nexra merger," I said, placing the document in front of him. "I believe there are significant risks involved that haven't been fully addressed." For a second, he looked genuinely surprised. Then, predictably, the skepticism returned. "You're still hung up on this?" he asked, flipping open the folder with exaggerated nonchalance. "Didn't we already go over this in the meeting?" "We did," I admitted, "but I've done additional research since then, and I think you'll find my conclusions compelling." He skimmed the pages, his brow furrowing slightly as he absorbed the details. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to hope that maybe, just maybe, he'd listen, that he'd see the merit in my argument and reconsider the deal. Instead, he slammed the folder shut and fixed me with a cold stare. "You really don't get it, do you?" he said, his voice low and dangerous. "This isn't about numbers or projections. It's about positioning, about making a statement. We're Hawthorne and Company, Lila. We don't shy away from bold moves because some junior analyst thinks she knows better." The dismissal stung, but I refused to let it show. Instead, I smiled sweetly and stood up. "Thank you for taking the time to review my findings," I said, collecting the folder. "I'll leave you to your call." As I walked out of his office, I felt a strange mix of anger and resolve bubbling inside me. Michael had made it clear that he wouldn't entertain any dissent, no matter how valid. But I wasn't ready to give up, not yet. Because hidden within the fine print of Hawthorne and Company-S corporate governance policies lay a clause I'd stumbled upon during my research. Any major decision requiring shareholder approval, including mergers, needed unanimous consent from certain key stakeholders. While Michael controlled the majority of shares, there were still smaller shareholders whose votes mattered, including mine. It was a long shot, sure, but sometimes the smallest stones can create the biggest ripples. And I was determined to find out just how far those ripples could reach. Over the following weeks, I began quietly reaching out to other minority shareholders. Most were institutional investors or wealthy individuals who rarely paid attention to day-to-day operations. Convincing them to oppose Michael's pet project wouldn't be easy, but I had one advantage: data. Armed with my meticulously compiled report, I arranged meetings, sent emails, and even attended investor conferences, tirelessly advocating against the merger. Some dismissed me outright, writing me off as a naive idealist. Others listened politely, but ultimately sided with Michael, unwilling to risk rocking the boat. But a handful, just enough to tip the scales, were intrigued. They saw the cracks in Nexra's foundation and recognized the potential fallout if the deal went through. Slowly but surely, I began building a coalition. Meanwhile, tensions in the office reached a boiling point. Word of my opposition leaked, and soon rumors spread like wildfire. Some colleagues whispered that I was delusional, chasing a lost cause. Others admired my audacity, secretly rooting for me to succeed. Even Michael seemed rattled, though he tried to mask it with bravado. During staff meetings, he avoided eye contact with me altogether, focusing instead on rallying support for the merger. And then came the day of the shareholder vote. The atmosphere in the boardroom was electric, charged with anticipation and thinly veiled hostility. Michael sat at the head of the table, exuding confidence as he delivered a polished speech extolling the virtues of the Nexra acquisition. Around him, executives nodded approvingly, eager to align themselves with the winning side. When it was my turn to speak, I rose from my seat, acutely aware of every pair of eyes trained on me. My hands trembled slightly, but my voice remained steady. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, addressing the room, "before we cast our votes, I urge you to consider the long-term implications of this merger. Yes, it promises immediate growth, but at what cost? Are we willing to jeopardize the stability of this company for the sake of short-term gains?" I paused, letting my words sink in. Then I launched into my presentation, laying out the evidence piece by piece. By the end, several shareholders exchanged uneasy glances, clearly rethinking their positions. Finally, it was time to vote. One by one, ballots were submitted, counted, and tallied. As the results were announced, I held my breath, bracing for whatever came next. But that, dear reader, is a story for another time. As the votes were tallied, the tension in the room was palpable. The air felt heavy, like the calm before a storm, and every second that passed seemed to stretch into an eternity. Michael sat at the head of the table, his usual swagger replaced by a rigid posture, his jaw clenched tightly as if he were trying to will the outcome into existence through sheer force of personality. Around him, executives exchanged nervous glances, some fidgeting with their pens or adjusting their ties, others staring intently at the board where the results would soon be displayed. Finally, the CFO cleared his throat and stood up, holding a single sheet of paper. "The vote is in," he announced, his voice steady but tinged with unease. He glanced briefly at Michael before continuing. "The merger has been rejected." A collective gasp rippled through the room, followed by stunned silence. For a moment, it felt as though time had stopped altogether. Then murmurs erupted, some shocked, others triumphant, and a few angry. I sat frozen in my seat, unable to process what had just happened. My heart pounded so loudly I could barely hear myself think. Had we really done it? Had I actually managed to stop Michael's $150 million deal? Michael's reaction came swiftly and violently. His face turned crimson, veins bulging in his neck as he slammed both fists on the table. "This is absurd," he bellowed, standing abruptly and sending his chair skidding backward. How could any rational person side with her over decades of experience and success? His outburst did little to sway the mood in the room. Several shareholders avoided meeting his gaze, while others simply looked relieved. One older investor leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms smugly. "Rationality had nothing to do with it, Michael," he said coolly. "Your vision might have dazzled us, but Miss Carter's data convinced us. We're here to protect our investments, not gamble them away on shaky ground." The words hit Michael like a punch to the gut. He opened his mouth to retort, but no sound came out. Instead, he sank back into his chair, visibly deflated for the first time since I'd known him. It was surreal to see him stripped of his invincibility, reduced to a man who had miscalculated, not just the vote, but the loyalty of those he thought he controlled. In the days that followed, the fallout from the failed merger dominated headlines. Analysts dissected every detail, speculating about internal power struggles and questioning Michael's leadership. Within Hawthorne and Company, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. Employees who had once tiptoed around him now walked past his office without fear, emboldened by the knowledge that even someone as untouchable as Michael Langley could falter. For me, life became a whirlwind. Colleagues who had ignored me before suddenly sought me out, eager to offer congratulations or advice, depending on their motives. Some treated me like a hero, others eyed me warily, wondering whether I posed a threat to their own ambitions. But amidst the chaos, one thing remained clear. I had proven myself in a way that couldn't be ignored. No longer was I just another analyst, or that girl who questioned the CEO. I was Lila Carter, the woman who had taken down Michael Langley's crown jewel. But with newfound recognition came unexpected challenges. Michael didn't take defeat lightly. In the weeks after the vote, he launched a quiet campaign to undermine me, spreading whispers that I was reckless, inexperienced, and unfit for leadership. He tried to paint my opposition to the merger as a personal vendetta rather than a calculated stand based on facts. At first, I worried these rumors might damage my credibility. But then something remarkable happened. People started pushing back. One afternoon, I received an email from Sandra Monroe, a senior partner whose opinion carried significant weight within the company. She invited me to lunch, which surprised me given how distant she had always been. Over salads at a quiet cafe, she surprised me even further by saying, "You've got guts, Lila. And more importantly, you've got integrity. This company needs more people like you." Her words gave me strength during a time when I needed it most. Other allies emerged too. Executives who admired my tenacity, junior staff members inspired by my courage, and even a few board members who saw potential in me as a future leader. Together, they formed a network of support that shielded me from Michael's attempts to tarnish my reputation. Meanwhile, Michael's grip on the company began to weaken. Shareholders grew increasingly critical of his decision-making, citing the botched merger as evidence of poor judgment. Rumors circulated that the board was considering replacing him, though nothing official surfaced. Still, the writing was on the wall. His era of unchecked dominance was coming to an end. Months later, I found myself sitting in the same boardroom where everything had changed. Only this time, I wasn't an outsider looking in. I was the center of attention. The board had called an emergency meeting to discuss the company's direction moving forward. And much to my astonishment, they asked me to present my ideas for restructuring Hawthorne and Company. As I stood at the front of the room, addressing the very people who had once dismissed me, I felt a surge of pride and responsibility. This wasn't just about proving myself anymore. It was about shaping the future of a company I had poured my heart into. I outlined a plan focused on innovation, transparency, and sustainable growth, emphasizing the importance of listening to employees at all levels. To my relief, the response was overwhelmingly positive. By the end of the meeting, Sandra Monroe stood up and addressed the room. "Lila has demonstrated not only intelligence and foresight, but also a deep commitment to this company's values," she said firmly. "I propose we appoint her as interim COO while we search for a new CEO." The room erupted in applause, leaving me momentarily speechless. When I finally found my voice, I thanked them sincerely, promising to honor their trust and lead with humility and purpose. Looking back, I realized that stopping the merger wasn't the real victory, it was what came after. That day in the boardroom taught me that courage isn't about never being afraid. It's about acting despite your fears. It's about believing in yourself even when others don't, and standing up for what's right even when the odds seem insurmountable. And as I stepped into my new role as COO, I carried that lesson with me. Because sometimes the smallest stones can create the biggest waves, and sometimes the underdog gets to write the ending.